like I said, I'd gone out and I thought of change as like protest. I thought of change as like policy. I thought of these things that were like really big, and that was hard for me because I never really saw myself as like a policymaker or somebody who could affect change in that way. And to your question about what I would want newborns to know, I think is a more personal thing to me, and the knowledge that I have after 30 years of carrying things in silence. I would want them to know that it's okay to talk and speak up about the things that hurt, that it is going to be challenging, but that once you speak up and talk about the things that are hurting and harming and traumatic for you, that you'll find that there's people out there waiting to receive your words and to like hold you in such warmth and to share their sorrows with you, to the point that you'll be in rooms where people are all sharing their sorrows, but it'll actually feel like some of the strongest connections and joy that you've ever had.
Welcome to Première, Personne, a podcast about vulnerable storytelling where we unpack the transformative power of first-person narratives. I am your host, Brune. Hello and welcome. Roxane Gay said of today's guest that he was, quote, an excellent writer who will be endlessly interesting to his readers, end quote. I'm really happy to bring you my conversation with Devan Sandiford. He is a Brooklyn-based writer, an award-winning storyteller, and the author of the forthcoming memoir currently titled The Silence We Carry, Confessions of a 6-Year-Old Father. His stories have been featured in the Washington Post, the Moth Radio Hour and podcast, Speak Up Storytelling, and many other outlets. He also has a story in Bodies of Stories, a collection of 20 vulnerable stories originally told live online that I edited and self-published in 2022. You can find it on Amazon or in the show notes. Devan Sandiford has contributed his opinions on race, identity, grief, parenting, and storytelling to articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post. But that's not where his story began. His story began with his silence, denying his inner voice and believing that his words didn't matter, after the fatal shooting of his uncle Ron when Devan was just 6 years old. So part of our conversation today does include some difficult topics, such as the one I just mentioned, but if you're in the right heart space and headspace, I'm sure you will enjoy it tremendously and gain incredible insights from Devan. Before we dive in, I just wanted to let you know that from September 3rd to October 29th of 2023, I am running a writing and self-publishing program. At the end of the program, on October 29th, we're going to have a big book release party. We're going to celebrate the fact that we will be published authors. The first 5 weeks of the program are dedicated to writing and revision. The last 3 weeks are dedicated to the self-publishing process. I am showing up live every week to help you through any hurdle you might come across, and I will be by your side every step of the way. If that piques your interest, or if that made you think of someone in your life whose words you want to see out into the world, you want to go to my website. That's at experiencenarrative.com, experiencenarrative.com. The link is in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and now without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Devan Sandiford.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, that's pretty good. All right, shall we?
Yes.
Hello, Devan. Thank you for being on the podcast today. How are you doing?
Thank you, first of all, for having me on the podcast. I'm really glad to be here. I think I'm going through a tough period right now with a couple of losses, but I feel great being here with you, and having an opportunity just to connect with somebody else, I think is always great.
Oh, good. Well, I'm really sorry for your losses, and I'm happy to see you. The last time I saw you was at the Brussels airport a few months ago, which was the first time we met in person after having been virtual friends for a couple of years.
Yeah, that was such a great meeting, and I remember it very well, and actually having stomach issues from the flight trip that I was on, but I'm so glad to see you.
Yeah, it almost didn't show on your face
That's good.
that you
That's
were
good.
struggling a bit.
I was
um,
struggling.
so I'm really happy to be talking to you today and to get to interview you, because the whole thing behind the podcast, the whole idea, is sort of about personal narratives and how people who start putting out their personal narratives out into the world, in whatever medium, eventually, like a lot of them, or a lot of us, I could say, end up wanting to allow other people to tell their stories. And you're definitely a prime example of that. So, can you tell us how old you were when you first started sharing a story with strangers and what form that took?
Yeah. I I did share one story when I was maybe like 13 years old. It was a written piece for like not a local magazine. It was like national to the United States, but a smaller magazine. But I hadn't written anything or shared anything since then. Just in my life, I've always just been like the type of person that was quieter and a bit repressed. So the first time that I really started to share my story again, I actually tried to start writing again probably in 2016. It felt like the safest place to do it because you could be behind your computer screen. There didn't have to be anybody there. But then I was able to notice that I was spending so much time trying to like have the perfect language to go with my story, and ended up deciding to go to the Moth to try and share a story just live in a place where I wouldn't be able to do any like editing or changes and things like that. And so the first time I got a chance to share a story with strangers was like in 2019, when I stepped on a stage at the Moth in Manhattan. I had gone to the previous Moth in New Jersey, but my name hadn't gotten picked. There was like I knew of the Moth, but I had never gone. And so when I went, there turned out to be like 50 or 60 people's names in
Yeah.
this like bag of like open mic storytellers. So I didn't get called the first time, but I came back and got called and shared a story about me and my mom and my grandma, um, and felt like, yeah, I felt what I was searching for as it related to like being able to express something without having it to be perfect, and felt a lot of relief from not having to hold it within me anymore. So
Mm.
yeah, it was really, really great for me.
What was it you think made you want to tell a story at the Moth?
So I had listened to the podcast here and there, but I wasn't like a person that listened to every single episode. So I knew of the Moth, but I had been talking to a friend who was like at the early stages of coaching people. Um, and I had recently written a piece that was accepted into a smaller publication called Writing Class Radio. And at the tail end of having that small piece accepted, I decided that I wanted to submit it to the Washington Post, and it got picked up like really quickly. As opposed to some of my other pieces where I had been working on them for a very long time,
Right.
editing them, changing them. This piece I had written in a short amount of time, and it was about something that I thought was small, and when I started, somewhat insignificant. But it was kind of just something honest, and I think that honesty really meant that it was received well. And I tried to like replicate that process over again. Like, oh, I'll sit down and write something honest again, and uh, being honest was a lot more challenging than I had given credit to, because there had been a lot that I was holding on to and hiding from, and not really wanting to share, or wanting to share but being afraid to tell the truth around.
Mm.
So I had mentioned it to my friend who was like doing this like um, coaching people, like life coaching, that like at some point maybe I'll go to the Moth and like I'll share there. And she's like, you should just do it now, like find one and go. And so I don't remember if she stayed on the phone with me. We were like on either FaceTime or Zoom. I don't remember if she stayed on the phone with me and was like, do it. But like just from her words and saying to do it, I found like the next one that was up, bought a ticket and went, and it was that one in New Jersey. And I think when I went, I didn't realize it was a thing, like a big thing. It was like in a huge venue. There was, yeah, I don't know the exact number of people that venue in New Jersey sat, but it was definitely like a venue where you would imagine like musicians to get on a stage that's like risen high up and had like lighting, and like there was a lot of people there. And I had come with a story that I had like kind of prepared, but also not prepared. And so I was kind of glad not to be called, but I did decide to go back to the next one, which was actually across the river in Manhattan at a small bookstore, which has a seating of, I don't know, 100, 150, but it
Yeah.
felt a lot more intimate. The sections, how they split them up, makes it feel
Mm.
like there's not that many people looking at you. And it wasn't a stage where you're like standing up above everyone and like talking down.
Yeah.
So I was really motivated and pushed, I'd say, by a very close friend who was doing some life coaching. I had mentioned something that I wanted to maybe try, and she said, "You should try it now."
And what has happened since? I mean, I should be more specific about that question, but how did that, what did that evening change for you?
Oh, that evening changed so much for me. Before that period, I wasn't the type of person who shared stories privately or publicly. Um, and when I got on the stage, I was so nervous. I was shaking. My hands were shaking. Nobody else could tell, but even me watching the video back now, I can see how nervous I was, especially at the beginning of the story. But maybe like 30 seconds into the story, I felt like just like this freedom and like this light. Even it felt like, it sounds pretty cheesy, but it felt like I was like a little star or a sun that was like starting to like shine and like illuminate of sorts.
Yeah.
And just having this really great feeling of like levity. And from the end of that story and having the people like respond and laugh and cheer and thank me for sharing my story, the Moths events are like also competitive. And so I came in second place for that show behind now someone who's a great friend of mine.
Yeah.
Um, but I was kind of hooked on the process of sharing my own story and just vulnerably without notes. And so I started to go back to the Moth regularly. They, at the time, had probably like two events, maybe even more, two events a month or more.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started to go that regularly and sharing my story. And I started to want to bring the storytelling that I was feeling back to the community of people that felt like they were more centered to me. The Moth is a great organization, but I noticed a lot of the venues that they had were filled with mostly white folks. And I wanted to, a lot of my stories deal with race, and I wanted to be able to look at folks who I could feel like they would understand without me having to explain or prove.
Yeah.
And so I actually ended up starting my own storytelling community. And I think that was like roughly around the time where we met virtually, where I had the first one was planned in person, and you had contacted me, and I think the idea was like, hey, why don't you do one virtually, or why don't we do one virtually? And at the time, actually, when you reached out, I was like, no, that's a terrible idea. I don't want to do that.
So that was like end of 2019 or?
End of 2019,
Yeah.
I thought to myself, no. And I didn't know it at the time, but I didn't want it to be virtual because that meant that people that I knew could hear the stories. And for me, the things that I was hiding from were people in my life. I had moved away from my family. My mom, my dad, my brother, my sister, all live in Southern California. I had moved to New York. I wanted to get to a place where I could share my story and the story of my uncle who was shot and killed outside of our home when I was little. But I also didn't want to have that be something that they heard and could be hurt by, especially my mom having to like relive this incident from me telling it. And so I wanted to be in spaces where I could share the story and they would never get back to them. And I didn't know at the time, but when you came to me about the virtual, there was that like fear of like, that means anybody can come, anybody can sign up. Obviously I could have also said like, no, like I'm only inviting these people. But as everybody knows, the pandemic hit just like a few months after we talked. And then the options were only sharing virtually. and yeah, accepted it at that point. We talked and started doing virtual shows, and it turned out to be the blessing in disguise, because that's what I really needed to do, to not only share stories with strangers, but to really get back to a place where I could share the stories with the people that I love, and to like not only call strangers to share their stories, but to call and share the stories, hoping my family would reciprocate and connect with me through the stories that we had never talked about. So ended up being a really powerful shift of like, I'm going to share stories for myself to strangers. Oh, I'm going to invite people within my community to share their stories. Oh, now this is a thing about me and my family that I've been avoiding, and to ask us to have conversations to talk about the things we've never been able to talk about, and to also invite them to share their experiences, to get that same, hopefully that same sense of relief that I felt.
Mm. So you mentioned a bit about the content of your stories. Can you tell us a bit more about the kind of stories that you tend to tell?
Yeah, I can. The first few stories that I shared were all, in my mind, about race. Um, I had come to the stage and thought, I'll share some stories that feel like they're meaningful to me. But as I started to share the stories, I started to see that they were like headed in a certain direction. And I shared a story about the conversations I was having with my sons about race. And that particular story, um, I shared at the Moth, and the Moth ended up putting it on their podcast. And a part of the Moth putting out on their podcast, they wanted to do some follow up questions, specifically
Mm.
about how my family talked about race at home, like my parents. And it was really in that moment that uh, what I had been avoiding was so clear to me. I knew that I had to like call my mom to ask her, first of all, if it was okay to talk about how we talked about race, because like I mentioned, when I was 6, my mom's youngest brother was shot and killed by the police outside of our home. And many of my stories come back to that central moment for me, and actually what happened afterwards, not with the police, but with my family not talking about my uncle and not talking about the incident. And me as a 6-year old, and moving away from our home to a predominantly white town, taking that approach to like holding on to things into like everything that I did.
Mm.
And so anytime an incident would come up, something that hurt, sometimes microaggression, sometimes forms of racial abuse or like racism, I wouldn't tell anybody. I would just like hold it and carry it for myself. And I did that for my whole life until I had sons of my own. Um, and I started to see the ways in which that silence was being passed to them. And so many of my stories deal with my uncle, some form of like silence that I had been carrying around that, or around things from my life that I ended up passing on to my sons in really damaging ways.
Mm.
Um, yeah, so most of the content has to do, I'd say, it does have to do with race, but more than race, it has to do with family, and more than family, it had to do with like the silence that I specifically was carrying.
Right.
Yeah.
How did your family react to you starting to share your story, which is sometimes also theirs?
Initially, um, initially when I started telling stories, it was in rooms of strangers. They couldn't hear.
Yeah.
The first time they even probably knew that I was sharing their stories was when I called my mom to ask for permission to talk about my uncle on the podcast. And it was really
Mm.
interesting. The first time I called her, she was had no emotion to her response. She told me I could absolutely share it, that it happened. And that was pretty
Wow.
much all she said about her brother. Um, but it did, I did ask some follow up questions about, um, what we talked about race. I remember talking about race a ton, but not talking about our specific things that were happening in our family. And so she ended up sharing a story of me coming home and asking what the N word meant, like the actual word. And I had completely forgotten that. But other than that, my family hadn't had any response at all to what I was sharing. Um, I imagine they would see the stories either posted on social media,
Yeah.
or other places, but they didn't really respond at all, which was actually more challenging for me than if they had responded, because then I started creating the responses that I thought that they would have. Um, the first time that they actually interacted with and like gave a verbal response, I had sent a video of me sharing a story to my brother. My brother is a teacher at his school, and they were having like a event for Black History Month. He wanted to share one of my stories. My brother had he had shared my stories found them amusing, from a place of being a good story.
Yeah.
I don't know if he had a response that relates to like aspects of the story that he was a part of. But I ended up sending him a video, and it was from that video at the time where my niece, who introduced me, was at my house, at my parents' house. They were staying with my parents during the pandemic, and my dad had watched that video and had commented how it felt like I think the words that he used were like bricks that were like cast upon him, that he didn't know that this had happened, and that I had never shared this incident with him. And if I had, he would have gone to like have done something about it. It was a story about going to this local amusement park and having one of the workers accuse me of stealing, and threatening to call the police on me, and me and my friends ending up showing that our pockets were empty. And I had never told my parents that story or how much it had affected me. And so him hearing the story for the first time and seeing how much it affected me, I think made him feel really surprised. And I had a really tough time experiencing that story that way. And after that, I had several moments with my family where I finally called my mom to talk about the things we hadn't talked about, and she was very gracious to have a very long conversation with me, and ended up needing to share portions of the story herself, that I could tell. Well, that was good, but my family, their response to it was somewhat of like, we don't want the stories to be shared, and any portions of the story that we're in, we definitely don't want shared. I think it took a lot longer to convince them or to show them the importance of it for me.
Yeah.
Which I think opened them up to be more okay with it. But I think it was challenging for them to hear and to realize that I was going to be so public with our family.
Yeah.
I don't know if secrets are the right word, but our family experiences.
Of things that had been kept silent for a long time.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though, what you say about their reaction sort of shifting over time. I think it's great for listeners to hear that, of course, it can be challenging at first to have those conversations with your family, but that then, some people do come to terms with it or can have a different reaction over time. And it's an ongoing conversation. It's not a one-time thing. Even though, of course, the first time you ask or you put a story out there is going to be pretty daunting.
Yeah, I think that one-time thing that you mentioned was absolutely what I was hoping. Initially, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was obviously several moments of racism, specifically in America, that were hard for all of us to deal with. But what it did for me, I live in Brooklyn, and where I live, there's a stadium right next door to my apartment. It literally touches my apartment, the Barclays Center. And so a lot of the protests were held right outside of the window. I could hear people chanting, say their names, I can't breathe. And especially the chant say their names was challenging for me because my family never talked about my uncle and I never voiced his name. There was times that I had often forgotten his name. And it was really challenging for me to hear that chant and to know that I had forgotten my uncle's name so many times. And initially I'd wanted to go out and join the protest and like go and change the world. The police, there's actually a police station that's like on the opposite side of us. So like we're sandwiched literally between the police station and the Barclay Center where the protests were. And so I'd gone out into the street for one of the protests kind of to try and make a change in the world. And at the time, our street was barricaded by the police. And when I had come back in to go back home, my wife was actually away. And so I'd left my sons, who at the time were like, I want to say like 5 and 8. I'd left them at home for them to like watch a show. And when I came back onto our street, the police didn't let me back in. And so I was like really starting to freak out. Like, no, I need to get back in. My kids are in our home, and I had to show them my ID, but my ID ended up having the old address on it. And so they wouldn't let me through. I had to like go back and forth with them for a long time. By the time they let me through, I was like really frustrated, but I was like trying to walk briskly to get back home as fast as I could. Ended up coming to, there was a neighbor that was walking on the sidewalk, a neighbor I'd seen many times. And they looked over their shoulder at me, like really like startled at first. So I was like, oh shoot. Like normally when I'm walking behind someone, I like make sounds to like let them know that I'm coming. I don't want them to be surprised. And I've had that feeling of like, oh, like there's a threat behind me. So I was like initially put off, but then they like kept looking over their shoulder like multiple times, like suspiciously at me. And I was just like, they had just come from the protest. I had seen them. I know them from the building. I saw when like it's a couple, the wife was pregnant. I saw when they had a baby. I've seen them push around, and I was just like so upset that these people were like out of the protest, but then also looking at me as a person of like a suspicious person. And it really was a moment for me to like understand that like I wanted to change the world, but I really needed to be inside to like work on the things that I had never done. I had never had the conversation with my mom. I'd never talked to my sons specifically about my uncle. I talked about race, but never about what I'd been carrying. And so I ended up using that as like the driver for like, I finally have to call my mom and have this conversation. And when I called her, I was really surprised that like me being open and vulnerable about the things I had been carrying ended up leading to her sharing portions of the story that I had never heard before. And it was the first time in my life that I'd ever seen my mom cry. And we had like this really great connection over the 3 hours that we talked, and wanting it to be, oh, that beautiful moment. It's done. I don't need to do anything else. Like, boom, I did it. Look at me. I actually went to the Moth and shared that story, and wanted to come to a place at the end where I was able to talk about the silence that I had broken. And I got to the end of the story, and I went to say my uncle's name, and I forgot my uncle's name again, the very last words of the story. And I ended up saying the wrong name. And because it was the last words, and I had like only heard myself as an echo, like I'd already started to step off the stage. And even if I hadn't, like, I don't know, like, do I say like, I'm sorry, like I said the wrong name? And like, it was really hard for me to experience that. And I just like went off. It was actually in a cemetery where they had this storytelling event. So I went into the farther down, found the back of like one of the mausoleums, and like dropped down and just like started crying, and just was so upset at myself for having messed up the story. And it took a really long time for me to like connect with my friend afterwards and my wife, and then for them to remind me that like your family hasn't talked about this for 30 years. You can't expect to go on the stage one time or to talk to your mom one time and for it to be over. And so that reminder that you gave about it not being a one-time thing and having to like share it over and over and over. And sometimes it doesn't go well. Sometimes it does go well, regardless of how it goes. And I think something you mentioned in the episode that you shared, that like I'm actually going to be okay, that I'm in a spot. I may be in a spot at the time when I'm not okay, but I will be okay once I process this. And so, yeah, it's been a lot of that, I'd say.
Yeah. And you are constantly sharing. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say. I think there was, like I said, at some point, the feeling of like, oh, I'm going to do this and it's going to be done. And once that passed, I find myself sharing all the time, first for the call to other people to share, because I find that the more vulnerable you are with other people, the more safe they feel to be vulnerable. They see you as a person that isn't hiding things and can hold things that are hard to carry. But then also for myself to share, uh, there's so many things over those 30 years that I kept in, and every single one of them is like a weight that I carry. And if I find it and I don't share it, then I continue to carry the weight, and it continues to be a hindrance to my life and the choices that I make.
Yeah.
And just by the process of sharing the story, I take a little bit of the power back to rewrite the story and find an ending that's meaningful and is allowing me to grow. And it no longer has to be this weight. It can be something that like kind of propels me forward. And so, yeah, I share as often as I can and as many places as I can, writing short pieces, writing a book, being on stages, any place I can share now. So I had a complete about face, went from not sharing at all to looking for everywhere to share. So
yeah. And earlier in the conversation, I think you mentioned something about changing the world. It was about the 2020. And I feel like you are on a mission to do your part in that.
Thank you.
What would you say is your why? What keeps you? I mean, you have mentioned things that speak to that, but maybe what do you want all children to know, for example, all newborns in the coming years? What would you like them to know?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And thank you for saying that you see me being a part of the change. I think that the specificity that you asked the question really helpful because, like I said, I'd gone out and I thought of change as like protest. I thought of change as like policy. I thought of these things that were like really big, and that was hard for me because I never really saw myself as like a policymaker or somebody who could affect change in that way. And to your question about what I would want newborns to know, I think is a more personal thing to me, and the knowledge that I have after 30 years of carrying things in silence. I would want them to know that it's okay to talk and speak up about the things that hurt, that it is going to be challenging, but that once you speak up and talk about the things that are hurting and harming and traumatic for you, that you'll find that there's people out there waiting to receive your words and to like hold you in such warmth and to share their sorrows with you, to the point that you'll be in rooms where people are all sharing their sorrows, but it'll actually feel like some of the strongest connections and joy that you've ever had. To speak up about the things that you're holding inside and to listen to other people when they're sharing their things as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I love that.
You created Unveiling Storytelling in 2020 online. It started as an online storytelling event, right?
Initially, it was in person, and then the pandemic hit,
right. Okay.
and we haven't gone back in person since. And Unveiling Storytelling for me as a community, as a movement, is something that I've always wanted to have since I've started sharing stories. And it kind of gets to the point of the change you asked me about. Because I had lived in silence for so long, and also not just me, but my family, it allowed me to be able to like hear things in between lines. So like when somebody says something, I know that they may be saying something with their words, but they actually might be meaning more like the body language or the things that they didn't say. And so beyond myself, I know that there's a lot of people who have portions of their story that they're not sharing. And I wanted to have a space where people who are on the more repressed side or quiet side to be able to have a platform to speak and to share their stories. And I think the pandemic was a blessing, but also was something that was challenging because it forced me to have to think of that in many different ways, when I think it would have been easy to like have it be in person and to like have those be a regular occurring thing.
Right.
Because the pandemic hit and there was like all of us, we had to go through that like the trauma of that. I went online to be able to start doing the events, but at the same time, I was going through my own struggles, and to stay consistent with like a community was really challenging. And so now I found myself trying to find ways to expand the community and to still show up for the community and make sure that people do still have that feeling of being able to share. Um, right now, it's like a community through Substack,
Yeah.
where I share portions of my life and hope that people will share their portions. I find that a lot of people in the community and who connect to the space are still pretty repressed, and so I will get like emails back, which I love to read myself. But in my heart, what I really want is for people to like share their portions of their stories like publicly to people, not just publicly to anyone who could like harm them and take their stories and be like damaging to them, but to people within the community who are supportive, so that it's not just a me thing that I'm receiving this story and then like I can connect with them. I think if people were to open up and be more public, even within this community, that they would get the sense of how many people are with them, and feel similarly to them. And so I'm constantly searching for ways to like, how can I get folks to share their stories, not just with me, but with others. And I think that's the current struggle. And also why I want to get back to having like live events, because that was something that I noticed was easier in person to me than online, because sometimes there's like during intermission, you might find someone and, oh, I just heard this story. Like, let me go find them. And now we're talking. After the show, there's like just that bubble of like people having conversations. And
Yeah.
I've had community events online where it's like open sharing. One person shares and we're just talking. We're not like, it's not a crafted story, and those feel great.
Yeah.
But I also know that they're like in online, it's always, and maybe I just haven't found the right space, but it's always one person gets to talk, everyone else is listening, and then the next person gets to talk, as opposed to like, oh, I connected with what that person said. Now we're having like a conversation on the side, or like, maybe there's a group of 5 of us and it's a smaller group and I feel more comfortable sharing in that space. Like, let me go do that. And maybe it's the idea of like, if I'm going to do it online, having breakout groups that can replicate that feeling of being in person, and like me finding 5 people I feel comfortable, or one person I feel comfortable with, or sharing in front of like a group of 20 people or 100 people, and adapting for the person's level of comfort and feeling of safety.
Right. It's so interesting to me the way we can design spaces that are comfortable for people to share and or to join and listen, because sometimes that's what they need, and they're not ready and they need 5 more years, but they still get to show up and get some inspiration and healing from the listening. What would you say are things that you have found to sort of work to encourage people to actually tell their stories?
I find that a lot of people take to doing actually storytelling workshops, that either one-on-one coaching or like small groups, that I will often have people ask me about joining those. And it's funny because I see them coming into the space, whether they like find me online or they find me in person, and it's like, I may have I don't really have any stories to share. And for me, hearing that actually have a story to share, and that's why I'm asking you, can you guide me along this process, or like just can you like ricochet what I said back to me so that I can share, like almost like in an iterative way of like, I might want to do this, and it's like, oh yeah, tell me more, and then they tell you more, and it's like, tell me even more. And so I find that people do take to the storytelling workshops, and especially the ones that are like 10 to 12 folks, a little bit more intimate. Those seem to be things that really help people out significantly. But yeah, like I said too, though, I think sharing stories myself vulnerably helps, from what I can tell, other people to open up. I was recently doing a storytelling workshop at work for part of our Black History Month. This year's Black History Month theme was Black resistance, and we thought of like storytelling or expression as resistance. And so we had this event where we had a workshop, and I ended up sharing some of the stories that you know me to have shared, some of the ones I just shared. And yeah, somebody had reached out afterwards and wanted to connect. Ended up having that they had some losses that they had recently had, and they wanted to talk about them. And we just met like just in that workshop, and here they are sharing like some intimate things with me, and then also following up on like the idea of like my opinion, my theory, my belief about sharing our story with children specifically, because I have talked and share stories about how I talk to my sons about these hard moments for me now. A lot of people want to know why that's the case and what I would recommend to them and their kids. And part of me, you know, doesn't want to like give recommendations as much as like saying why I do what I do. And it really is from that place of being a child, thinking to myself that I have to hold these stories, that we don't talk about them, and then feeling so alone as a result of that.
Yeah.
And then once I shared and especially with talking with my sons, seeing how they open up and share portions of their life with me. And so, yeah, being vulnerable with myself, having workshops, and just as many different avenues for storytelling as I can think of without over committing myself seems to be what works. Because like you said, some people feel more comfortable writing, some people feel more comfortable one-on-one, some people feel more comfortable just listening. And I try and remember, and even you just saying that was a great reminder for me, because and I brought this up before, but it took me 30 years to talk about some of the things that happened in my life. So the expectation that someone will hear something and immediately share is not always the case. So as many places as I can, opening avenues and channels for people to share their stories in ways that they feel comfortable, or just to like find their way into it as they find more courage.
Expression as resistance. I love that. You just mentioned kids, your own kids and kids in general. And I feel like one of the things you've been doing is reestablishing or just establishing a conversation between generations within your family.
Yeah.
And I think it's very timely as we, as a culture, go into like sort of discover intergenerational trauma and what gets transmitted without us necessarily knowing. What does that bring up for you, that idea of a conversation between generations?
Yeah, the conversation between generations for me brings up, for me the things that I learned from my sons, the things I learned from my sons, the things that I teach my sons, the things that I unknowingly teach to my parents, and the things that my parents teach to me. I think because fatherhood was a big driver for me to tell stories, initially when I was actually in France, so I was in your home when storytelling really took root of me. My son and I wish I knew the locations better, because you probably know them really well and could imagine them. But we were walking along a river
Was that in
in like
Paris,
one of the
or?
farther. It was in Paris, but it was in one of the farther, like I don't know, what do you call them? Are they districts? Are they
Arrondissement.
they're like numbered?
Yeah.
Yeah. Say it again.
Arrondissement.
Yes. We were farther out from the city center, walking along this river. We had just taken a boat ride, and my son had asked me about this incident. He asked me out of the blue about why I didn't report these police officers. And it turned out that I had shared the story of when I was 21 with him about being surrounded by the police. And I was so annoyed with his question because it came with no context, and it came at a time when we were just like enjoying ourselves. Like, why is he bringing this up right now? And we ended up having this really long conversation about race. And I was like, okay, I did it. We're done. That's the end of the conversation. I was ready to like enjoy the rest of my vacation. Like, we're there to have fun. And we had moved from Paris to Lyon to the south of France in Nice. And when we were in Nice, I had been doing some writing on the notes of my phone and had this incident where this mother had like thought that I was being suspicious, and she whispered something to her husband. Her son heard that, and the way that he was looking at me just made me feel like he was like trying to process like, why is my mom so worried about this guy? And as much as her like whisper had power on her son, it was like me seeing how much power my words had an impact on my son. And the fact that I had been like just kind of rushing us through this and didn't want to talk about, and also had been telling him for years that like I didn't report the police officers because I knew that my words would have no impact, that my words didn't matter. And for a long time, those were the words that I was putting into my son, that our words don't matter, our words don't matter, our words don't matter. And literally breathing in, don't speak about these things to him for like 3 years. And I think coming to that and having wanted to be a father my whole life, or like since I was 10, it was really hard for me to to see that like to see that I was the one that was putting that message into him. And so he, in that moment, he wasn't there in the moment with the mother, but in that moment was teaching me about how much like words do matter, and how much my words matter to him and the things that I say to him. And we ended up talking about that, and like we had the conversation about what I should have done in the moment with the police officers, or afterwards, and speaking up about it. It was my older son who really drove me to understand the power of our words on our children, and the power of our children's learnings back on us. And so taking that message and really thinking of it intergenerationally for my family, it turns out that my grandma, my mom, and my dad all witnessed my uncle being shot. So I didn't know this at the time, but my grandma used to tell the story all the time when people would come over. And I must have just like not been there. But that was her way of dealing with this incident. Whereas for my mom, being a young mother at that time, it was really challenging for her to hear her mom tell the story, because every time her mom told the story, it was as if she had to relive it, and she hated that. And so she decided that she never wanted to talk about it. And her never wanting to talk about it caused me to have this feeling of like holding these things in, and then needing to learn how to talk about it. And so the conversations from my grandma to my mom to me, and now I'm, the parent, wanting to express myself, but also knowing the dynamic of like, what does it feel like for the next generation to have so many things expressed? Maybe I should know when to speak and when not to speak, and understand how to share my story in a way that's appropriate for my son's age and the frequency at which they hear it, and to make sure that I'm considering them as individuals that may want to speak about it and may not want to speak about it. Maybe they need some more space. Maybe they need more time. Maybe they want to talk about it right away. And having two sons and having them be so different has helped me with that. My younger son almost loves to have conversations that are like to the heart of things. He saw me crying after watching the video of Ahmaud Arbery, and he was like, can I see it? Can I see what you're watching? Like literally seeing me cry and wanting to see what I'm crying at. Whereas my older son, he could do the same thing, and he could like actually have this moment where he was like closing his ears, closing his eyes of me like telling a story, and me pausing and like instead like giving some space to like, this is why I'm doing this. Let me pull back and like tell you the reasoning behind it. And then me being able to pause watching him having a hard time then allowed him to express something that he was having trouble with at school. So those conversations, I think, intergenerationally, and knowing that like sometimes I'm helping people, and sometimes I'm hurting people. Like telling the story could cause my mom to have to relive this, could cause my other uncles to have to like deal with things that they hadn't dealt with. And maybe they're not ready. Where in other cases, expressing might help someone else open up and be vulnerable. So understanding that like intergenerationally, there is, I don't know any other word to describe it right at this moment than to say like work to be done into understanding the ways in which our words have real impact, both positively and negatively, and just being present enough to know that and to adjust.
Yeah. This just reminded me of, I don't know if you've read it, it's a book called Why We Write About Ourselves. And it's 20 authors who write about 20 memoirists, and one of them is Cheryl Strayed, and the other ones I forget. And in it, there's a quote by, I think, Pat Conroy. He says something along the lines of, silence hurts people, telling the story hurts people. It's all a matter of figuring out how much good the story can actually do by being shared. And it's such a fine line sometimes. And, who is to say if we get it right or not, but we can only try our best.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that quote, and definitely hits on the point of like the idea of like safe space. People for a long time have been talking about like, oh, let's create a safe space. Let's create a safe space. And there's this poem by, I think it's Beth Strano, who talks about, instead of thinking of safe space, thinking of brave space, because we live in the real world. Like there's no such thing as a safe space. Like you can be triggered or hurt at any time. And so instead of safe space, think of a space where you're entering into it bravery to be vulnerable. And you're also entering into it as a listener, being brave that this might be something that's hard, and that the space and the sharing will never be perfect. And that's kind of what makes it beautiful, that we're in it together and that we're going to work our way through some of these challenges.
Yeah. I have one last question, which is a bit different from the conversation we've had, but it's about writing. You are writing a memoir. Can you give us the title?
Currently, the title is The Silence We Carry, and the subtitle is Confessions of the 6-Year-Old Father.
Can you give us a bit of information into your relationship to writing, to the creative process and writing?
Yeah, I can. And I think it's interesting for me because a lot of the people I hear who write have talked about them writing from like such a young age, like that they've been writing their whole life. And that is so terrifying for me because I haven't been writing my whole life. I used to love to write when I was a kid, and had a book, like not a book, a piece go out and was published. I remember being paid $50 for when I was 13. It was awesome. And if I had known that people could write as a primary profession, then maybe I would have followed the path earlier, but didn't know that, went into an engineering field, never wrote any creative works. I had writing from work, writing from school, but never wrote at all. Didn't have any journaling practice or any of that. And so writing for me has been something that I picked up later in life again. And initially, I thought of writing as a way of like telling the story, but then like perfecting it so I could send it out and have it be perfect. I would look at every single synonym for words, try and find the right one. And then I've had the shift into like, instead of doing that from my storytelling on the stage days, finding a way to tell the story honestly as the primary focus of writing. And then really thinking of like revisions as the way of like bringing out more truth, as opposed to revisions as a practice for making the work perfect. So that has been my relationship to writing. The pandemic, again, for me was a gift as it relates to writing, because we weren't going anywhere. We didn't have things to do outside. I had a lot that I was carrying at the time, and writing was a form of release for me that allowed me to be okay through all of what we were going through. And so I wrote every single day during the early months of the pandemic. That first year, I'd say every single day I wrote, and I had a writing partner who would write together every single night, and that was really helpful, and was able to get a rough draft of my book out through that. Since then, I don't necessarily always write every day. And I've heard other writers who also don't. I think there's people who think like you have to, and there's people who think that there's like space to do. Maybe you write, maybe you have some other expression, maybe you're listening to music. I heard Roxane Gay in her, maybe it was Masterclass, but it might have been another place, talk about that she sometimes writes in her head. So she'll be working through a draft, and when she's ready, she'll go to the page. And so I try not to be too hard on myself that I have to write every single day. And instead having a practice of writing and a time to write every day. And if I don't make it that particular day, it's not the end of the world. I can come back the next day and write. And even on the days where I'm not sitting in the chair, the stories are still living in me, and I'm working on them. While at the same time, knowing not to take more than like a few days off at a time, because even if it's shifting to another piece, that's better than like not writing at all. I find that for me, if I take too long of a break, when I come back to the work, it's unfamiliar to me, and I don't have that like proximity to it, and proximity to my own voice, I'd say. So even if it's working on a different piece, and then returning to, that helps out much better than just like not writing at all.
So good. And so to finish this up, this is perfect because you also have a newsletter. I know you don't like the term newsletter, but it is what it is. I really recommend it to everyone. In it, you sort of share your life just like you did with us today. Where can people find it, and can people find you?
Yeah, that's a really great question. My easiest place to find me is probably on my website. It's devansandiford.com. Devan is with an A. You can subscribe to this newsletter through there. And also I'm on all social media platforms, or maybe I shouldn't say all, but I'm on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and recently have got on TikTok, but I have not posted anything. And actually somebody had my name already. So
oh, really?
I don't know if anyone will be able to find me, but Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, I'm at Devan Sandiford as well, at Devan Sandiford on social platforms.
Thank you so much for chatting with me today, Devan. I wish you so many great things for this year, and I hope to see you again very soon.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast, Brune.
If this podcast means something to you, it would mean so much to me if you'd be willing to take 30 seconds to do each or all of these 3 things. First, can you please follow or subscribe to Première Personne? While you're there, if you'd be willing to give me a 5-star rating and review and share an episode you loved with a friend, I would be so grateful. Première Personne is produced by me, Brune Smith, and you can email me through the contact form at experiencenarrative.com. Thanks for being here. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll talk to you soon.